Amnesia: The Dark Descent is 8 years old at the time of writing, and that fact alone terrifies me more than the game itself. I think it would be fair to say that the small independent horror classic was a big shock to the system, for not only the industry, but for the genre as a whole, in addition to modern entertainment. At the start of Amnesia, you are forced through a doorway opening, and by the end of the experience, the world changed. But first, let's set the scene. The start of the 7th generation was not kind to pure horror titles as a whole. Sure, you had action horror games like Condemned Criminal Origins, Fear, and Dead Space, but compared to the much more prolific 6th generation, it would be safe to say that horror was being ignored completely and put down as a mere genre element. And that was really sad. The 6th generation saw the release of Silent Hill 2, 3 and 4, Fatal Frame 1 and 2, the Resident Evil remake, and Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem, which gave that console generation an incredibly diverse set of horror titles with very different approaches to fear, suspense, and gameplay. By the time the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 came around, attention was diverted to games' longevity in the market, as internet speed and accessibility increased, a focus that doesn't seem like a natural fit for horror. After all, once you know where the nail-biting tension comes from, in addition to knowing where specific jump scares are, its impact is mostly lost on a second playthrough. Not to say replayability and longevity can't exist in horror games. It's one of the reasons why I return to Dead Space regularly, in fact, thanks to the game's satisfying and crunchy combat system. But come 2010, the industry decided that traditional horror games don't sell because, well, that's what they said. Within that climate laid a small development studio in Helsingborg, Sweden, releasing 2 horror titles during that time period that would become cult hits: Penumbra Overture and Penumbra Black Plague. Not to say that releasing them wasn't a struggle. In fact, Thomas Grip, the designer, programmer, and arguably the figurehead of Frictional, said that Black Plague nearly collapsed a few months before release, until Paradox Interactive provided the funds to secure that game's release. During that time, Frictional started to get basic tech work done for what would become Amnesia, so that they were better prepared for their next project. Black Plague came and went, but they still weren't ready. But Paradox asked them to make an expansion to their recent release, so they had a bit more time to prepare while making what would become Penumbra Requiem. During development, the team at Frictional said that they were going to do another horror game. They were going to make it much more simpler in design in comparison to Penumbra, and they were going to put a major emphasis on making something that would be easy to pitch to publishers and funding bodies. By the time they submitted what was then Lux Tenebris to the Nordic Game Program, the major theme of darkness being an enemy within gameplay stuck. They were approved by the program, Penumbra Requiem released, and Frictional dived headfirst into what would later become Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Though that name wouldn't come around until January 2010, 16 months after the team started full-time work on the project. Development went through several ideas during this time period, and it's interesting to read what was considered as written in the game's design document. Character dialogue and NPC interaction was considered, so was weapons, so was enemy killing, but they couldn't find anything that was engaging. Even worse was the publisher hunt and the search for more money. Originally, it was going to be part funded through a bank loan and part funded by the aforementioned Paradox, but then the loan was turned down, which caused Paradox to nearly completely back out of the project. The contract was signed on April 2009, shortly after the decision was made to remove weapons. However, less than a month later, Frictional was forced to break the contract, and everyone was essentially given 1 month's notice unless funding was acquired. Design changed drastically to try and get something out quick and not let the assets go to waste, but it proved to be impossible. Fortunately, the Penumbra game soon went on sale at a 75% discount, and while Paradox had the rights to Black Plague and its expansion, Frictional had complete rights to Overture, and with the weekend sale outselling the lifetime sales, there was finally a sigh of relief. More changes were made. The Super Mario 64 style hub design was traded out for more linear design, and the story and setting went through some changes. Changes that ended up being a point of contention with the game's writer, to the point that the two parties parted ways. The game also got a new motto: like Penumbra, but better. 2010 rolls around and two things happened. One, the game went into alpha, and two, they ran out of money again. They put the game up for pre-order alongside a trailer, but the response was tepid. Looking back at the trailer is an interesting watch. They got the prison vibe all set up, while also showing levels that were either left on the cutting room floor, or were made just for the trailer. The cash flow problem was solved with a deal with Russian publisher 1C Soft Club, but it meant that there would be nothing left but a completed game come the game's September 8th launch. More so, they put the Penumbra series on Humble Bundle, that not only raised more funds, but got Amnesia: The Dark Descent to exceed their initial 2,000 unit pre-order goal. That's why there's developer commentary in the game, as it was promised if Amnesia hit that initial sales target.
From the beginning, this level was more of a mood level, with not much more to do than to explore it, find a diary and then continue on.
In the final months leading to release, more things were cut. A currency system was cut, a progress meter was cut, the number of items per level was lowered, and the focus shifted to tonal presentation. Sanity became a core feature, and after the demo shipped, the devs scrapped the idea of having your sanity get healed through potions, much in the same way laudanum does to health in the final game. Interestingly, the final game shipped with a secret file containing videos of the pre-alpha, and it's quite startling to see how much the game changed. It more or less resembles a collectathon in retrospect. The development of Amnesia: The Dark Descent was a difficult process full of ideas and drama that had Frictional constantly on its knees, constantly changing gameplay and level design. In fact, one of the original ideas was to have the archives be much larger, but due to difficulties, including the developers not being able to get the spider territory to work properly? What? Anyway, the level was split into 2 or 3 parts: the archives, the cellar archives, and potentially the study. Even the final days weren't relaxing. Alongside crunch, they had to handle review copy logistics, and came to face a terrifying truth. If the game didn't sell 24,000 units come November, Frictional was to close down. Thomas Grip was actually preparing his resume just in case. But there was some light at the end of the tunnel. IGN gave an Editor's Choice Award to the game 5 days before release, and while it's maybe just one review, Thomas Grip credits this review for giving him some form of relief. For the first time, I felt these 3 years of hard labour might actually amount to something. Little did they know that they would release a monster. If Amnesia made me realise something about video games, and what the difference is between a mod that sounds complete and one that sounds empty, it's that atmosphere makes or breaks the first impressions. The ambient sound design in this game has aged incredibly well, and is an element that still gives me a sense of uneasiness, and contributes to some of the level's more iconic statuses. The earlier, possibly connected study and the old archives, on the surface, look the same with some lighting adjustments, but each location feels so different thanks to that ambience. Not to say that sound is the sole reason why Amnesia's atmosphere is so fondly remembered. It may have been the area that's garnered the most award attention, but the lighting and textures do a fantastic job in reigniting my long-lost fear of the dark. The morgue is my favourite example, and I really like how the lamp doesn't light too much of the environment, but just enough to make it a core survival tool. Textures may have aged middlingly, but it's hard not to commend Frictional's fantastic bump mapping. There's also music, which is up there with Nier Automata, Hotline Miami, Silent Hill 2, and the Soulsborne games as some of my favourite soundtracks ever composed. Miko Tamiya did a great job in nailing the right tone needed for certain rooms, creating a feeling of constant dread without it becoming too grating. It might come as a surprise that, despite the difficult development, composing music was comparatively easy, which is why there are so many different tracks in the game. There's the little tracks that are used upon the completion of puzzles or reading diary entries, and there are those that play throughout the time you spend in a particular level, as well as when monsters enter the playing field. The Grunt's hunting music is more well known, but I have a softer spot for the Brute's hunting music. It feels like the theme of a home intruder movie, and it's incredibly effective. There are other tracks I love that play as backing music to the levels, like the Wine Cellar, the Cellar Archives where you encounter the iconic water monster, and the fan favourite Back Hall theme, which can be described as the calm before the storm. It also makes the levels that don't have music all the more eerie, and it demonstrates Frictional's restraint to not over-deliver and overload the senses, but instead create a more tightly knit product. And that focus can be seen in the game's story. The design documents may have been overly optimistic over nonlinearity, but in the end, it's managed to deliver something that is simplistic but effective. It's a classic in medias res story structure commonly seen in video games, where we start in the middle of the story and piece together Act 1 along the way. This is achieved through relevant flashbacks that do add intrigue, even if I am confused by the inclusion of some I'll touch upon later, as well as notes and diary entries scattered around the castle. Some contain recounts, instructions, or folklore that adds a degree of mystery to the castle, inhabitants, and the shadow that is continuously hunting you throughout the game. The story's greatest effect comes when it doesn't tell us everything, and leaves some questions up to the player. Were the monsters working alongside Daniel before he drank the amnesia mixture? Or were they kept away from him until he rebelled against Alexander? Is the Shadow a human-sized entity whom is bound by the physical barriers of the castle, or an omnipresent spirit closing in on the orb? How was this Grunt killed? Where does the conch come from, and why is it invisible to the naked eye? How does Daniel escape the castle, even though the only elevator was destroyed upon usage? I just love this method of storytelling, and it's akin to Bloodborne in some way, a suitable comparison considering the Lovecraftian influence they both take. It is a tightly focused experience that's fondly remembered for good reason. I don't think this game would have been as successful if it wasn't for the pacing of each level and hub world, and it's why those whom have played it remember many locations and sequences for many years afterward. I don't think the backhaul would have been as memorable if it wasn't for the tense encounter with an unseeable foe and subsequent chase directly before. Same goes for the individual levels and how the main enemies are encountered throughout, especially in storage. It remains one of my fondest gaming memories, seeing the horror genre get reignited in the gaming industry. Not by AAA publishers or millions of dollars of resources, but from a small team who are constantly on the ropes, and for that reason, I am eternally grateful for this game. But there's a reason why the title of the video is Why I Loved Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and that's because replaying the base game has shown some design decisions that doesn't really add up. Like, why are entries of Daniel's diary in odd places? Why are there 3 entries on Alexander's ritual in the cistern in 3 incredibly convenient locations? Why did Daniel take the amnesia mixture in arguably the most inconvenient location possible? Why does Daniel recount memories that have absolutely nothing to do with him, and which he did not witness? A lot of events get weirdly convenienced to the point that it comes across as parody, like how the best way to enter the chance cell is conveniently locked, forcing you to go through the sewer system. There's also music. Not to say that the music isn't great. In fact, Miko Tamiya's compositions have aged incredibly well, and still elicits uneasiness and calmness when appropriate. No, this criticism is focused on the usage of monster music. You might have noticed that there is a lack of monster footage, and the stuff that is included in this video are there because of mandatory encounters, or because I went back to reshoot some footage. That's because you can hide to your heart's content until they despawn, and you'll know when they despawn because their hunting music fades out after they finish going through their path nodes. Compare that with Alien Isolation, where the xenomorph AI adjusts its behaviour and hunting patterns constantly. This makes monster gameplay quite repetitive, and their encounters do lose some edge after some time. Also, the level design. According to Thomas Grip in an article documenting the development of Amnesia on The Escapist, the initial idea was for there to be a Super Mario 64-like structure to the level design, in that there would be a hub area, and the individual levels would branch off from it. That idea was mostly scrapped, so instead of a Super Mario 64 structure, it would become more like Crash Bandicoot 2. Hub area, complete levels, go through a highly dangerous zone, enter the next hub area. As a result of this change, the process of going through Castle Brennenburg gets formulaic. In fact, the second and third hub areas have arguably copy and pasted structures in design. There's a descend and exit that is unavailable due to outside factors that you need to rectify. There are 2 rooms that present little to no danger. One of the rooms in each of them is relatively small, with the puzzle solution self-contained in the room, and completing it triggers a one-on-one encounter with an enemy. There's even a machinery puzzle requiring you to pay attention to the environment and loose objects that are lying around. This is followed by a descent, and it's hard not to see the scars of troubled development, especially when Thomas Grip himself admitted that they had the beginning and end thought out, but had issues coming up with the middle part. And finally, the biggest major problem with the game is something that could not have been foreshadowed by the developers or players. Amnesia sets the trend for how horror would mostly work going forward, and being the trendsetter means that any unique elements it had, in comparison to horror games that came before, means that those elements are going to be played out in the years going forward. As a result, Amnesia has become retroactively generic to the point that some of the stuff that's frightened me to my core, like the traditional fire lighting up, no longer has that oomph factor it once had. But that's also a reason to celebrate. Amnesia was the horror game equivalent of a cattle prod to not only the genre, but to also the whole industry. For one, it demonstrated that independent releases weren't isolated to quirky puzzle platformers, like Super Meat Boy and Braid. Combined with Limbo, it showed that darker genres can sell if well put together. It squashed the perception that horror could only be a mere element to a more action-oriented game if it wanted to sell. Amnesia was drenched in horror, was made on the cheap, had no multiplayer elements, and it sold. The mechanical influence of Amnesia could also be seen come 2012. You had Slender, The 8 Pages, SCP Containment Breach, and Anna take clear inspiration from the Swedish creation, with Outlast the next year refining some of the rough edges to create my personal game of 2013. The influence was so deep that it took until relatively recently to have horror reintroduce clunky gun combat back in. And then there was the influence outside of horror. At its core, Amnesia is a walking simulator that's cleverly disguised, and combined with the fact that Gone Home was prototyped in the HPL engine used to power Frictional's outing, and the fact that they ended up working with the Chinese Room, who were one of the first to give this method of storytelling a try, Frictional's influence on the gameplay light philosophy runs deep. As for Frictional themselves, they finally got a great sigh of relief, as the popularity of Amnesia grew and grew. They were able to get reasonable salaries, but also a raise on top of that, and the experience they got from Amnesia has clearly stuck. Their next game released 5 years later, and the improvements are clear as daylight, to the point that I called it the best game of 2015. Even if it wasn't my personal favourite. Not to say they have abandoned Amnesia completely, in fact their experience with console development for Soma proved beneficial, as in 2016 and 2018 they re-released Amnesia for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One respectively. As for PC, the game got updated with achievements, and this year they added a hard mode that addresses the monster music problem I brought up earlier. Although a more accurate name for the difficulty would be Challenge Mode. But the question remains as to why I loved this game so much, to the point that I have collectively spent over 60 hours on this game. Amnesia has one of the most accessible modern architectures I have seen. Levels could be made quickly with the assets, and it was easy to start playing both custom stories or full conversion mods ranging from core gameplay adjustments to ones that could pass off as expansions. You can do some really neat stuff with the engine, and one guy ended up creating a Tetris mod. I'm going to link some of my personal favourites down below. My personal favourite is Through the Portal. And the ripple effect didn't stop there, because Amnesia was a game that would show marketing potential through an interesting medium.
Oh shit, I have a bag of Milky Way. Oh my god.
Around the time Amnesia came out, the YouTube video scene was dominated by Call of Duty videos. That, with the exception of a few personalities and a guy who destroyed trees, emphasized the skill in their play. But in the span of 3 short months, 2 games would solidify themselves as the new kings of the YouTube video scene. One was Minecraft, and the other was Amnesia. The latter was initially confusing, since there was no replay value, no multiplayer, and had a comparatively small audience, especially in the long term. But when you think about it, it makes perfect sense when you consider 2 things. One being that a game like this hadn't been made in a while and was easily accessible, and 2, that it is much easier to form some sort of connection with these players since their videos relied less on practice and skill and more on just being some guy in a situation. Everyone has their own personalized set of fears. Some are unfazed by it, but those who do react to the horrors of Amnesia will have a very different response to another person. And if something like I'm a celebrity, get me out of here can be successful by putting people in situations that make them uncomfortable, what was stopping games from doing the same? Call of Duty had a great run at the top of the YouTube scene, but the problem was the aspiration of being a great player in a certain field made it harder to empathize with them. If you take a look at the more high-profile YouTubers today, most of them had their profile boosted thanks to this game. They were wacky and over-the-top at times, but they were at least relatable. They weren't honing their skills at shooting, they were just trying to get out of a situation that made them deeply uncomfortable. And you can find a wide variety of creators playing this game, from PewDiePie to the late great Total Biscuit. For better or worse, the unlikely developer, Frictional Games, changed the gaming landscape forever, and it would be difficult to imagine the industry without Amnesia: The Dark Descent.